Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to the first of two papers we have this spring on Ionian Island history. It's a great pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Athanasios Gekas, who is with us by the happy chance of having a sabbatical at the Institute for Historical Research at the National Research Centre. So, of course, we kidnapped him to speak. He is Associate Professor and Hellenic Heritage Foundation Chair of Modern Greek History at York University, where he teaches very widely on the modern Greek and Mediterranean history topics. His work on the Ionian Islands is extremely extensive. He's not, however, Ionian. He tells me he discovered this by going to university on Corfu and fell in love with the region, which happens to rather a lot of us at various points in our lives. And since then has been publishing, to say, extensively. We're looking forward to his new book, which is going to be a history of the Ionian state, forthcoming this year, reasonably soon, one hopes, which I think will be quite a landmark work in the history of the region. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Professor Morgan, thank you very, very much for the invitation. It's a delight and an honor to be here and have the opportunity to talk about the fairly recent work, but it's also an opportunity for me to reflect on the topic that has, for many people, occupied their thoughts recently after the country fell into the... Shall we turn the lights?
Yes.
Because it's probably easier for everyone to follow. Thank you. It's something that has been in the minds of many people in the last few years, and I think it makes a historical a comeback mainly. The title I chose is a phrase from a parliamentary debate and is a peculiar people not properly governed, although the phrase was a peculiar people properly governed, and the subtitle State Building in the Ionian Islands under British Rule, 1815-1864. First, let me clarify that it's important to keep in mind what is the meaning of proper governance. What is the most appropriate form of government at each particular point in time and for each particular place. The answer depends on the social, economic, political and religious status of those involved in a society of approximately 230 to 240,000 people who are involved in what I call a colonial situation. The phrase in the title comes from the 1820s, when British rule in the form of the Ionian Protectorate was still relatively new, if not fresh, and was debated in the British Parliament. The first part of the sentence, a peculiar people properly governed, encapsulates the perception that many, by no means all, British officials, whether in the islands or in London, held for Ionians. A peculiar people. Tom Gallant has written on the constructed images and identities of Ionians that British officials, especially those on the ground, grafted for Ionians after a few years or even weeks they had spent with a less than European but more than Oriental they meant in the Ionian Sea. They often called them, Tom Gallant tells us, the Mediterranean Irish, expressing their aloof contempt for a people that were unequivocally Christian, therefore, at least in the 90+% majority, therefore more European than other subject colonized peoples, and of Greek descent, but were insubordinate enough to resemble the Irish. Tom Gallant's approach, drawing heavily on concepts and categories from historical anthropology, is perhaps the most debated among historians of the Ionian Islands. The other approach of maritime history, especially in the work of Jelena Harlaftis, studies Ionian shipping and maritime economy and the activities of Ionians in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. These are just two, but I think quite important works and approaches on the periphery of what I will try to do today. There are also other, of course, numerous with smaller impact writings on the Ionian Islands who have the islands a venerable historical tradition. For some of them, they call it the Ionian School of History. And it is still organized in the every 4 years Pan-Ionio conferences, each time in a different Ionian island. So the approach I will discuss today is less popular, but well overdue, as I will try to convince you, and it is most rewarding in terms of historical analysis because it goes right into the heart of the relationship between Ionians and British, and reveals the capabilities but also the limits of the colonial state, the state formation that emerged in the Ionian Islands during the 50 years period. So this approach of state formation, or state building as I prefer to call it, in a less abstract and more tangible way, is well overdue because the case of the Ionian Islands allows us to enter historiographical debates that hold center stage in the history of colonialism, but also in the history of modern Greece. The case of the Ionian state forces us to rethink several issues that are central both in the history of colonialism, and let me start with a brief comment on the latter, on the history of modern Greece, which is dominated by the emergence of a state under King Otto, while there is a less focus on the short Capodistrian period, and more on the decades that followed Trikoupis coming to power. So there is both a gap in the history of the Greek post-revolution state in itself, and in comparison with other Greek states, the Ionian state, one of them, in the region. There are benefits in a comparative analysis, as long as we get the units of comparison straight. First of all, there is a lack of data for the first few decades of the Greek states. Still, it is important to keep in mind that there are very few studies who try to look into the workings of the early Greek state, the first decades basically, of King Otto's Greece. While there's a lot of interest in the history of the Greek state recently, the best-selling book by Kostas Kostis proves the point, there is less research and debate on the first steps of the Greek state towards modernity. The expression modernity is not an abstraction, or in inverted commas. The process of state building, especially in the case of Greece, was precisely that, a process that went through the various stages of the post-Ottoman condition, the state of backwardness, in inverted commas, as many historians and political scientists have called it since the 1970s. And in the case of Professor Vertilis and his history of the Greek state, who sees the state being in a perpetual state of reform. Delving into the early history of the Greek state, one is taken aback by the too quick statements on the state and its deficiencies, compared to an often idealized European and always monolithic, always Western European, and in some recent exceptions, Balkan states, such as the exception of my good colleague Tassos Anastasiadis and his colleague Nancy Clayer, who have looked mostly at the ideological parameters of state formation in various Balkan countries. What we are lacking are systematic studies of state building at the institutional, but also the practical level. How did the state work? In the case of the Ionian state, the British factor, to adopt the phrase often used by many current and past social scientists and historians when they discuss relations of Greece with other countries, the foreign factor, was obviously especially important. It is also important at this point to consider a perception that has recently emerged and has achieved hegemonic status in public discourse. That is, Greece as a special kind of colony. Being in the margins of Europe, the recent and ongoing crisis has magnified the status of the country. These ideas were, we are now very clear, a result of the colonial and imperial interventions by European countries to Mediterranean ones. The debate is fairly old, but not that old. Michael Hertzfeld has argued for a while now, back in 2002, in his so-called crypto-colonialism article, that European powers allowed some nominal sovereignty to elite groups to, as he says, consolidate their authority, using culture as its primary measure and economic coercions as its most compelling instrument. End of quote. The crypto-colonial condition had of course a political and in fact a constitutional dimension. And as Michael Hertzfeld says, the Greek monarchy was always derided as foreign because it was widely perceived to be a key agent of this crypto-colonial process. It was not culture, however, but the role of the state in the everyday life of its subjects that really makes this different, and how Greeks perceived, I think, both in the past and today, their relationship with the so-called foreign factor. And this is one of the most insightful ways to understand the so-called colonial encounter. Mediterranean histories and histories of Mediterranean islands of the modern period are told either in polemic anti-colonial narratives or from a national or one imperial power point of view. I have in mind Mitchell's excellent Colonizing Egypt, for example, and other approaches to British colonialism in the Mediterranean, who works also on French colonialism in Africa, and to some extent the critical to Italian colonialism approaches. Or more recently and more productively, it is told from the point of migrants, so it's a much more from below approach, such as the work of Julia Clancy-Smith, who has shown very clearly why migration was important. First of all, because it is topical, because migration in the Mediterranean continues, only that it has a reverse trend. Up until the mid-19th century, people from the European South migrated to North Africa. Only the last few decades it has been reversed, because it is at the center of the relationship between states and subjects. Until today, migration and immigration, specifically to Southern Europe, is a very, very hotly debated issue. And of course, because one is able to identify, if one is able to identify life stories, makes history more tangible, and readers could relate to them and connects the history of the colonized from below, unlike books, for instance, that either enumerate imperial strategies, as was the old school of imperial history, or discuss structures and systems of power in the Mediterranean, which is more like the content of Robert Holland's new book, Blue Water Empire, which does focus on the presence of British in the Mediterranean. So the study of islands is important because they are the quintessential Mediterranean places. But not all Mediterranean islands are born equal for the study of colonial encounters. The Ionian Islands stand out as they were on the so-called frontier between the Muslim Ottoman Empire and the Christian Venetian Empire up until 1800, and the Italian peninsula more broadly. The sophistication and wealth of studies for the early modern period has not been matched by specialists of the modern Mediterranean, with the exception of the Eastern Mediterranean that attracts considerable interest, especially in the late 19th and 20th century, and from the point of view of historians of the Ottoman Empire, or from the point of view of very interesting intellectual histories, such as the Eastern Mediterranean and the Making of Global Radicalism, 1860-1914, by Ilan Makdisi. So the state in the Ionian Islands was part of the process of state formation in the Balkans and the Mediterranean from the late 18th century onwards. The formation of Greek states in the 19th century, the Septinsular Republic, as it was called, the state between 1800 and 1807, the Ionian state after that, the Greek kingdom, the Principality of Samos, just to remind you something that is very much ignored, and the Cretan Republic for a period of about 14 years, belongs to an old tradition of granting autonomy to these regions out of necessity and diplomatic pragmatism. This flexibility is exemplified, it's a long tradition again, in the Republic of Ragusa and the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, which in the 18th century were granted to members of the Phanariot Greek Orthodox elite to administer. These states emerged in the periphery of Europe and the intersection of European states with the Ottoman Empire. Historians have studied these states mostly from the point of view of the expansion of the Greek state, or have barely studied them at all, with the exception, of course, of post-revolution Greece, which dominates accounts of modern Greece. Look at, Veremis and Koliopoulos, for instance, The Making of Modern Greece, or Greece, the Modern Sequel, an older, more thematic book. The creation of these states had consequences for the people who ruled under the various forms of government, and I think it's important to distinguish between the different forms of autonomy that each place enjoyed. So the autonomy granted to various regions of the Ottoman Empire demonstrated special characteristics depending on the place, offered significant revenue to the Sultan, and allowed local elites, more importantly, to rule, rewarded as they were for their services, or simply because they were too distant and these places and too troublesome to control by force. The creation of a state in a region that managed to secede from the Ottoman Empire, as a post-revolution Greece did, with a heavy impact, of course, later on of Russia, Britain, and France, was a bright exception, not the norm, in the 19th and even early 20th century at the time. Arguments about the gradual disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and its long-lasting decline neglect the fact that for some regions of the empire, some sort of autonomy was the most common experience, and only to some extent set the ground for revolutionary nationalist uprisings in the 19th century, as a sort of more romantic, nationalistic-centered historiography would like us to believe. The period now from 1800 to 1814 saw not only British domination on distant parts of the globe, but also the rise of the Anglo-Mediterranean order, as Robert Holland has called it. During and especially after the Napoleonic Wars, the Ionian Islands experienced the application of rational principles, social engineering, and the substitution of the rule of law in place of the rule of men, as one historian called it. Ionian societies experienced facets of modernity for the first time during the first French occupation of all the islands by the Republican French and the occupation of Corfu by the Imperial Napoleonic French between 1807 and 1814. This was not, however, an Ionian Sea or Mediterranean story. During the Napoleonic Wars, British military expansion, if I may remind you, in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean presents some striking resemblances. The islands, for example, of Réunion, Seychelles, and Diego Garcia passed under French rule in 1803, when Napoleon supported the revival of slavery and gained the backing of the local elites. In 1810, a British fleet with 10,000 sepoys sailed from India and took over the islands. Around the same time, a similar takeover took place in the Ionian Sea. In 1809, the British, or Anglo-Corsican as people called it at the time, fleet carried hundreds of Corsicans, Sicilians, and Maltese who manned the ships and fought on behalf of the British Crown in the Mediterranean. These are the people that occupy the Ionian Islands. Sepoys in the Indian Ocean were an established force for British imperial expansion, South Africa in 1795, in Egypt in 1801, and Ceylon, Sri Lanka in 1803. Similarly, the fleet of the recent Mediterranean acquisitions fought and conquered the southern Ionian Islands in 1809 and 1810. This abrupt transfer from French to British control of islands and regions from Asia and the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean all the way to the Caribbean marked the post-Napoleonic global balance of power. This is the context in which one can understand a lot more clearly, I think, what was happening in the Ionian Islands from the British, at least, point of view. And from the Ionian too. Thomas Maitland, the first High Commissioner in 1815 in the Ionian Islands, had considerable experience as he negotiated with Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, the treaty that agreed the withdrawal of British forces from Haiti and served as governor of Ceylon and Malta before taking over the command of the Mediterranean and the Ionian Islands. Maitland embodies best the circuit of colonial officials during and immediately after the World War against Napoleonic France. So the state in the Ionian Islands emerged out of the French-Russian, French again and finally British political, ideological, and last but not least economic influence. My argument today and in the book is that however influential the foreign presence on the administrative structure of the Ionian state, the protagonists of state building were Ionians. Centuries of an administrative tradition included corruption, mismanagement of resources, rent-seeking, clientelist relations of patronage between Venetian governors and Ionian officials, as Greek historians have very clearly showed. But they also included elements that are extremely important for the shaping of what Michel Foucault and others have called the modern governmentality, a venerable archival and documentation tradition, such that it was entirely absent or at least rudimentary in Ottoman Greece, and a tradition of families involved in state administration whose members were trained in the University of Italy and France. One of the key factors for understanding the process of state formation is the history of liberalism that recently attracts considerable interest by historians of the Mediterranean. Liberalism was a central project in the history of colonial modernity, of course. It's not just a form of political thought. British historians are very good at showing that, particularly historians of India, as well as Patrick Joyce, mostly for Britain. The colonial Ionian state introduced a series of liberal reforms in the islands that shaped this hybrid semi-colonial polity. Its study offers another perspective to the global dimension of liberal modernity, as it's now called, characterized by bureaucratic practices, statecraft, commerce, consumption patterns, and above all, the rise of a civil society. Ionian civil society was especially the work of Ionian merchants, intellectuals, lawyers, civil servants, and some British colonial officials who redefined power relations based on liberal values. Ionians created a public sphere of political parties and groups, philanthropic and literary societies, clubs, and social events. There is no doubt that decolonization in the islands in 1864, however, owed much to the 10-year or more constitutional struggle of the radicals, and to a lesser extent the rather timid mobilization of the Ionian people, depending on the island we're talking about, against British rule. Nevertheless, the decision to cede the Ionian Islands to Greece was a decision made by the British at their own time and in their own terms, notwithstanding the political developments in Greece and the overthrow of King Otto in 1862. A study of the ways in which the Ionian state was organized under colonial rule and the power relations exercised can tell us about the ability of British colonial rule to adapt but also to coerce indigenous populations to achieve the most effective and costless rule possible. Why is it important to do that? Economists and economic historians have studied intensively the relations between institutional development and the comparative economic development performance of states. Many agree that consolidated, functional, and therefore successful national political systems depend on institutions that provide services for particular and crucial fields for economic activities, such as transport networks, banks, education, and the emergence of a civil society. The way these institutions and services were financed is therefore at the heart of any debate on how did such a national political system develop in the regions that gradually formed the Greek state. The fiscal state, of course, was crucial also for the development of liberal regimes. Greek historians have traced the origin and establishment of liberalism and its role in the development of the Greek economy and state to a lesser extent. We know a lot less, and this is where I intend to contribute, about the reconstruction of fiscal and financial regimes, although a lot has been done on the banking history of Greece, and let me remind you that the development of economic history in Greece, for instance, is inherently bound to the history of banking through the research archives of banks, especially the National Bank. Public finance, of course, is a major feature in the development of modern European societies, and it is at the heart of the definition of the nature of political regimes. Public finance is also a most relevant issue in the understanding of the constraints and possibilities of economic development. The study of state finance that documents the rise and development of taxation systems, expenditure regime programs, and debt regimes is essential in understanding the capabilities and evaluating the achievements and assessing the difficulties of each government at any given time, as we're finding out today. And it's also fundamental in the writing of the history of Greek states in the 19th and 20th century. Just to give you an example, the establishment of parliamentary budget control in the 1848 reforms in the Ionian state, especially control over public spending on salaries, was just one of the many steps that sought to legitimize the Ionian state in the eyes of the Ionians. It is also one of the most overlooked reform, while everyone focuses on the free press, freedom of the press, for instance, and the extension of the franchise, undoubtedly important as these were. However, most debates focus on this new terrain for Ionians, the control over public finances. Changes in the tax composition, the extension of voter franchise, of course, and instances of political leadership were also crucial elements to engender public trust. It's a different matter that they had the opposite of the desired effect, as some British observers had cautioned. But unlike the emphasis on the reforms that allowed freedom of the press, there has not been enough discussion on how Ionians demanded and perceived and then received the fiscal reforms that allowed the more extensive control of public finances by the Ionian Assembly. And we're not talking about the salaries, but overall spending and how it is allocated. So from that point of view, the period could be divided into three parts. The imposition of an absolutist rule after 1815, but with a facade of constitutional liberalism, the transition to a liberalism of reforms in the 1830s and 40s, and the extension of voting rights and freedoms for the 1850s onwards until the countdown to union that the radical unionists set off. It is well known and has been convincingly argued that the difference between Britain and Europe was the fiscal regime and the rise in Britain of a military fiscal state unparalleled in the continent. Such comparisons can guide research and the study of the formation of different tax and fiscal regimes in the various states that gradually merged or were absorbed, if you prefer, by the Greek kingdom. For the period we look at, however, the two states should be considered separately and distinct as they actually were. And I'm going to try and give you a few examples of how apart they were, especially the Ionian state, from this point of view, the management of public finances. One thing I'm not going to talk about, although it is extremely important, is the relationship between banks and the state. In each case, the Ionian Bank and the Ionian state in one case, the National Bank and the Greek state in Greece on the other. Between 1815 and 1850s, Europe and Greece experienced also an unprecedented period of peace, with the exception of the Revolutionary War. Even the Crimean War in the 1850s, that affected directly and negatively both the Ionian state and the Greek kingdom, as they found each other at opposite camps, the first enforcing a neutrality, since it was part of the British Empire, and the latter allied with Russia and experienced the first direct intervention of France and Britain through the occupation of Piraeus and the consequences it brought, the outbreak of a serious plague epidemic, among others. The political rights that were granted in each state are also important, but I think it has been compared to a certain extent by other historians. What has not been done is to estimate the cost of spending for defense, especially in times of peace, for the Ionian state, basically after 1815, and for the Greek kingdom after 1828, and the weight of this spending that was linked to levels of economic development in each region. Let me outline now some of the differences and also some of the examples to draw a timeline for the story of the Protectorate and locate the meaning of proper governance in the plans, aspirations, ambitions, but also misconceptions of the protagonists in the story of the Ionian Protectorate. Quote, when we consider that the American United States contained 12 millions of people, the Ionian United States 190,000, the one a continent, the other all the islands united, about half the size of Yorkshire, the annual revenue of the one about 6 millions, I suppose, for I do not know exactly, the other one 140,000 pounds, that is to say, inferior to the income of some English noblemen. When we consider these things, it may be truly said that the Lord High Commissioner of the Ionian United States can have no claim to a salary equal to that given to the President of the United States of America. End of quote. Charles James Napier, whose words you just heard, and governor of Kefalonia in the 1820s, was the man who was there in the Ionian Islands before he embarked on a distinguished career as governor of India that earned him a statue in Trafalgar Square. He was also the most outspoken critic of the British Ionian administration in the 1820s and dared compare the two United States. Quote, although one is but the miniature of the other, it is said that a cheese maggot placed in a solar microscope appears like an elephant, and about the same proportion exists between the United States of America and the Ionian Islands. Yet, the salaries of their rulers are on a par. Napier had quite a few things to say, and much less polite, about the quality and cost of British administration, especially in Kefalonia that he knew best, where he presided for nearly a decade and wrote extensively about in his treatise, The Colonies. The Ionian Republic was re-established in 1815 as the United States of the Ionian Islands with the Treaty of Paris on November 5, 1815. The constitutional ambiguities of the articles, however, nothing creative about them and constructive, created an anomalous state. According to the first article of the islands were to form, quote, one sole, free and independent state under the name of the United States of the Ionian Islands. The second article placed the islands under the immediate and exclusive protection of the King of Britain, and the third, just to add to the confusion, gave to the states, quote, the power to regulate their interior organization, but with the approbation of the protected power. These ambiguities transformed gradually into contradictions that were never resolved and prevented the islands from assimilating to the British colonial structure or taking their own course. The Treaty of Paris also stipulated that the first Lord High Commissioner had to devise a constitutional charter that would be ratified by the King of Great Britain. The framing of the charter was largely influenced by the character and experience of Thomas Maitland, who justified to his superiors his actions to concentrate to the seat of all powers to the seat of a High Commissioner in the following way. I was in possession of very few books touching on the subject, and the whole of the document now transmitted to England has been made more with a view to the general ideas stated by your Lordship to me in England and the general view of the characters of these people than to any precedent we can look at, or any constitution we can have recourse to, which of course was not true because you consulted the Constitution of 1803. To continue, they are not in that state of society that fits them either for a free constitution or for being left to themselves under any government of any kind. This no man's land condition of political maturity of Ionians was Maitland's excuse for imposing an autocratic rule. The lack of any similar precedents, as he called them, was more a pretext than legitimate reason for designating all powers to the office of High Commissioner. Immaturity of Ionians to rule themselves was a recurrent theme in British discourse, and not just for the Ionian Islands, of course. And perceptions of Ionians and their loyalties from the early days of the Protectorate, British views and perceptions of Ionians and their loyalties were quite hazy, but British priorities and imperial plans were unclouded. Ionians had a, quote, interesting character and were, again, quote, the only ascendants of ancient Greeks that had not passed under the Turkish yoke. The same extract from the parliamentary debates in 1820 continues. Mr. Leslie Foster was convinced that the new arrangement, the interests and tastes of the islands were best consulted. National independence was not their desire. They had tried that during the French Revolution. He quite agreed as to the interesting character of the natives, who were the only ascendants of the ancient Greeks that had not passed under the Turkish yoke. The inhabitants knew that Turkish ambition aimed at the islands and that they could not preserve themselves by a parchment treaty. They disliked Russia and they detested French as protectors, and England appeared to be their most salutary protector. They were a peculiar people, and if properly governed, would be most attached subjects of the British Empire. Corfu was one of the strongest places in the world, but he hoped, Mr. Leslie Foster, the islands would not be managed on a military principle, though troops in each isle might be necessary. It should be rendered evident to the people that in civil affairs they govern themselves, and they would then prove the most valuable acquisition, securing us a strong port in the Levant, preventing any other power from raising its standard in the Morea, making us the arbiters of that part of Europe, and giving us the power at the mouth of the Adriatic Gulf. He thought no arrangement possible which could be better than what had been concluded, to end the long quote. The story of the Ionian Protectorate is largely the disillusionment and frustration of many colonial officials and members of parliament with those peculiar people that never really became most attached subjects to the British Empire. So these states maintained the federal state character of the Septinsular Republic, but with important modifications by Maitland. The political identity of the state was liberal in the sense that citizens as individuals enjoyed certain constitutional freedoms under the protection of the British monarch, of course, but in practice, British commissioners allowed very few liberties. The Ionian Islands, therefore, formed the colonial state only to an extent, according to the definition, for instance, by Steinmetz, that a colonial situation, political sovereignty, has been seized by a foreign political power, and the indigenous population is treated by the conquering state as fundamentally inferior, for example, as barbarians, savages, heathens, an inferior race, a stagnant civilization, or denizens of a failed state. While Ionians were not treated as equals, they were responsible for their affairs within limits, and on some occasions the aristocracy impressed the British with their education and cosmopolitanism. Most importantly, they were considered immature and permanently unfit for government. Even Capodistria considered the Treaty of Paris the best possible fate for his fellow Ionians. Despite political principles, Maitland bypassed the constitutional obligations of the treaty and produced the Charter of 1817 after lengthy deliberations with the Colonial Office in London. This was the rule to justify an absolutist and autocratic rule. Maitland and other British officials, consistently even up until the 1850s, often used the analogy of the immature and childlike Ionians. This was the rule of colonial difference, according to which there were stages of political development and maturity before people supposedly reached a modern and progressive phase. It has to be said that Ionians themselves internalized this discourse when they refer in memoranda or petitions to the British Commissioner. They often evoke his paternal care. The end of Venetian rule in 1797 forced the Ionian political elite to abandon their mainly managerial role and assume a government and decision-making role. And I think this is the important turning point in the history of the islands. The political rationality of government, what Foucault called governmentality, requires distinguishing between sovereignty and government and between discipline and government. It was during the Septinsular Republic that some independence, even if truncated, was achieved, and Ionians for the first time acquired experience in running a state under Russian Ottoman military supervision, and later under French and British colonial rule before they participated in the Ionian state. I don't need to remind you that Kapodistrias himself trained in the art of government in the Septinsular Republic before his illustrious career in Russia. This independence remained predominantly in the field of institutions and law in particular, the field of excellence and expertise for many Ionians, and it was in this field of law that the battle for decolonization and the end of xenocracy, as Ionians called it, was fought. Since for radical unionist Ionians, the Constitution of 1817 was not only unjust, but also illegal. Maitland laid the foundations of Ionian colonial governmentality and kept in place mechanisms he found from the period of Septinsular Republic. He was also, and unlike in his term in Ceylon, however, he was fortunate enough to find among Ionians a number of experienced state officials that he was quick to employ, realizing that importing more administrators from Britain would be costly and perhaps undesirable. Maitland also introduced a system of pensions for state officials, similar to the pensions assured to colonial service officials elsewhere in the empire, and Ceylon specifically. However, for the Ionian state, he provisioned a pension for all its employees, the overwhelming majority being, of course, Ionians. This was ratified in 1830 with an Ionian Act in the Parliament that established a fund for the supply of retirement pensions for life to be granted to public civil functionaries, as they were called, which the Greek state kept paying for quite a few years after the islands became part of Greece. The Ionian state continued practices developed under Venetian and French rule and assigned to police authorities the role of regulating and controlling a range of economic and social activities, the labour market, the population in the country especially, and the political activities and attitudes of Ionians towards the regime, but also towards the Greek War of Independence, as well as the revolutionary movements in Italy. So it's the Ionian state managed to have a very impressive surveillance network, both between its subjects and foreign countries, but also within the islands themselves. Something that was used not only for, let's say, national security or state purposes, but also for terms of who was fit for employment or who was not aggressive enough towards British rule later on. The French first upgraded and reorganized the police and social control mechanisms inherited from the Venetian period during the period of occupation 1807-1814, especially in Corfu. In 1811, French administration merged the various police forces, the High Police, which was kind of a secret police accountable only to the governor, both the French and later on the British Commissioner, and the municipal police into the General Commissariat de Police. Interestingly, one of the first activities of the new force was the recording of the natural movement of the population, births, deaths, arrivals, departures, more like a social science department, a research task than a police mandate. In March 1818, the first act of the first parliament of the Ionian state established the three police forces, the high, executive, and court police. You can see how seriously the state takes its work. You know, if the first act ever of its government is to establish the police forces. Building a modern colonial state involved creating a strong police force and a surveillance system to support it. Police under British rule integrated existing institutions and practices that were based on modern social technologies of surveillance and control that the Ionian state used and exercised often with very little restraint, especially against political opponents of the regime, shutting down newspapers even a few weeks after they had been allowed, confiscating their correspondence, sending them off to Antikythera, for instance, in perhaps the first act of political exile in the Greek regions. An efficient and sophisticated network and bureaucracy was put in place. Police recorded information on the conduct of individuals when someone applied for employment in the civil service, for example, and informed other departments when Ionians petitioned for a grievance. British and Ionian officials created a police organization that expanded in all islands with a system of surveillance, especially on politically suspect Ionians or other nationals for subversive activity against the protectorate. The story of the Bandiera brothers, for instance, is one of the most famous one It is a failed, miserably failed attempt in 1848 to rise against Austrian-Hungarian rule that was stopped before even the Bandiera brothers set off from Corfu for Calabria. During this first period of British military rule, however, and before the facade of independence granted by the Constitutional Charter of 1817, the authorities had faced successfully the first serious challenge in the islands that had nothing to do with political activity. And this was one of the first of many. This was the plague outbreak of 1816 and 17, and the local that was stopped very much in the south of Corfu at the source. And the doctor responsible for this operation wrote, Richard Tully wrote, "Under such dangerous emergencies as those we have been recording, the strong hand and unnerved power of government must be interposed, or the evil rapidly delays itself." This was the first time Ionians experienced the strong hand of a government, only this time it was for their own good, as Richard Tully wrote, a central claim in all governmentality projects. Systematic investigation and drastic measures, the recording of the disease and its symptoms, its causes and ways of transmission, but especially the rapid response of the authorities, was a prelude for what would follow during the period of British rule in other similar events. Now, of course, what occupied mostly the minds of British colonial authorities was the issue of keeping public order. The colonial office allowed governors to administer local issues through a combination of general rules and practices, but also with the experimentation and flexibility of adjusting to local conditions. Distance from London, measuring in some cases thousands of miles, meant that decisions could not wait for weeks until the letters to the colonial office had been read and orders were dispatched. When Maitland served as governor of Ceylon, it took one of his first tasks to save the treasury £200,000, he only received one mail with a note from the Undersecretary for the Colonies. To answer every dispatch sent by every colonial officer was an impossible task. In 1825, communication with the colonial office, which was officially established as a separate department in 1831, became more regular with the organization of the Ionian Post Office. Even then, however, communication with London still took 4 to 6 weeks. Until Corfu was connected to the telegraph system in the 1850s, it was not uncommon for high commissioners in the Ionian Islands to decide first and consult later. The volume of communication was simply extraordinary, making it difficult to handle even after the reforms of the 1820s. Letters, for instance, that arrived to the office on March 11, 1823 in London included dispatches of several months from, to quote, Ceylon, Mauritius, Cape of Good Hope, Gibraltar, Malta, the Barbary States, and the Ionian Islands. After all, officials in London were interested primarily in two things: the uninterrupted and secure commercial operations and keeping public order. On some occasions, such as the one of the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence, it's interesting to see that perspective, colonial officials were also interested in how to avoid a diplomatic incident, first with the Ottoman Empire, and then in 1830 onwards with the often erratic Greek kingdom. So the Ionian state built an efficient bureaucracy that continued the legacy of previous administrations, but introduced a more systematic communication between the central government in Corfu and the local governments in other islands, as well as the communication I mentioned between the commissioner and the colonial office. Correspondence between the commissioner in Corfu and the residents or governors of the islands was frequent and detailed and formed part of the surveillance systems I explained earlier, especially during the Greek War of Independence, which really alerted officials and authorities in Corfu and other islands. In 1821, not only Maitland, but colonial officials also adopted the discourse of paternalism and argued that the recent turbulent history of the Ionian Islands did not qualify them for enjoying perfect liberty. Others supported Maitland as well, revealing the divisive effect of the Ionian issues in British Parliament. When Castlereagh intervened, he reminded MPs that the islands were not a colony and could not be ruled by a constitution offered by Britain. This was a rhetorical and institutional formality, of course, used to avoid the real issue of challenges to British rule and constitutional arguments that the Ionians and British raised. Maitland imposed a centralized state and gave extraordinary powers to the post of High Commissioner, but at the same time he was shrewd and far-sighted enough to understand recent Ionian political history. After 2 decades of instability, social conflicts in most islands, especially Kefalonia, and successive occupations by other imperial powers, British administration and Maitland wanted stable governance, and this is what most Ionians wanted too. Tranquility is the word that keeps turning up in documents of the Ionian state, and it was also the state name of British administration, but also in debates in the British Parliament. It was the landowning families who were experienced in local politics and administration through their participation in the island's councils for decades at least. These were the dominant and hegemonic groups in Ionian societies and shared the same goals with Maitland, order and stability. Rather than a radical break in the history of the islands, the British takeover and the formation of the Ionian state represent a continuation of the previous political order under the overwhelming authority of Great Britain. This is the only discontinuity. The real turning point would come later, first in the 1820s with the outbreak and outcome of the Greek Revolution, and then in the 1840s and 50s with the rise of reformism in the Ionian Islands, liberalism and outright hostility to the British regime of the Protectorate. Ionian lawyers, very much central in this process, were highly trained. They played an important role in the reformed criminal justice system. They wrote it basically, and that is because training in law was traditionally a qualification for acquiring social status and political rights. State building accelerated in the 1820s with a further organization of the courts, the police, the state archives, but especially with the regulation of professional groups, lawyers and assistant attorneys who lacked a degree in law but possessed adequate and accredited court practice. These interest groups, together with notaries, remained indispensable in a contract society and an administration with an efficient bureaucracy. The debates over the codification of the labyrinth of laws of the chaotic legal system, if that can be called, in the Ionian Islands was explicitly the work of these people. It was the first time experts, Ionian jurists, took on the task to codify the island's chaotic legal system. There were some of the reforms during Frederick Adams' term as commissioner in the 1820s, but it was a process that was completed finally in 1840s. Unlike the constitutional charter that was drafted very quickly by Zamit, the Maltese trusted assistant of Maitland, the Committee for the Codification of Laws consisted of lawyers such as Halikopoulos Manzaros from Corfu, Dionysios Flambouriadis from Zande, Fokas Kosmetatis from Kefalonia, Kondis from Lefkada, Carouzos, the secretary of the Ionian Academy, and the English secretary to the Senate, always present there, overlooking how debates in Parliament and works go. The team reflects the federal character of the state, but also the power of the political class and the aristocratic families, a result of their negotiation and compliance with British colonial officials. Other people were instrumental, though, in the state bureaucracy. Panagis Marinos Salomon, for example, another statesman from Kefalonia, published in Bologna in 1822 the project for a code on commerce and navigation of the Ionian states of the Ionian Islands that he dedicated to the Ionian government, as well as the treatise on commercial failure and the essay for the improvement of agriculture, essay on the political economic causes that hinder the progress of agriculture on the Ionian Islands, also in Bologna in 1825. Ionians were not short of ideas on commerce, of course, agricultural reform as well, and played a central role in drafting the legislation to achieve the stated goals on which both liberal Ionians and many commissioners agreed. British colonialism involved more than formal or informal political influence, access to markets and military considerations, but also the desire to control natural and human resources. As a result, to quote, the form and content of the knowledge that was produced out of and enabled resource exploitation, commerce, conquest and colonization has moved to center stage among historians of British Empire, to quote a recent historian of the British Empire. Commissioner Maitland and his commander Adam used whatever colonial knowledge was available to them when they took over the islands and succeeded in overcoming the challenges of plague, the arrival of a refugee population from Parga, and the regions where the Greek Revolution broke out and in the meantime, before in 1819, crushed an armed rebellion in Lefkada. So very early on, they stamped their seal on how the Ionian state would evolve, how it was going to be formed. Colonial governmentality, however, was a much wider project that included collection and application of colonial knowledge generated in the Ionian Islands or transferred from other parts of the empire. Napier, who I mentioned earlier, acquired experience while serving in Kefalonia, and he was also very crucial through his project of road building that still forms the main network of roads in Kefalonia, opened by Napier and Ionians, most importantly in the 1820s, is just one example. The British imperial project, however, for the Ionian Islands rested on military and geopolitical priorities, especially actually this was, after all, the meaning of protection. But once the British took over the islands, they had to rule approximately 220,000 people. Infrastructure works, such as roads, bridges, lighthouses, the administrative buildings were part of the developmental project that many colonial governors and modernizing Ionians promoted. Living standards of the Ionian population and improvement of living conditions, or progress as contemporaries called it, depended on the finances of the Ionian government. And these instead determined the ability to carry out public works and thus improve living conditions. Sources, such as the Blue Books of Statistics, collected by the British authorities for colonial administration purposes, documents of the Ionian state bureaucracy, and accounts of Ionians and British contemporaries, reveal a colonial system that found fertile ground among the educated Ionians, who followed the logic of accountability, transparency, and innovative expression of interests in the public sphere, but also through collective petitions. This is where you see actually their most interesting points and suggestions. The collection of statistics in the Ionian state and the dissemination of numerical information and knowledge culture, if you like, were embedded in the colonial discourse of modernity in many places in the 19th century. But many Ionians adopted it since the early 19th century. The French administration espoused the opening of the Ionian Academy in 1808, founded by Ionian intellectuals to compile the first statistical, as it was called, Register of Corfu, following the principle that only populations that are known and identified can be governed properly. The Academy commissioned the first statistical recording and scientific project of measurement of population in Corfu, which is a turning point in the history of the islands, and by the time the British took over, the making of a modern bureaucratic Greek state under colonial paternalism, and partly because of it, was well underway. It also contrasts a superficial, timeless argument about the presumed inefficiency of the Greek civil service, since Ionian Greeks were perfectly able to adjust to the requirements of British colonialism and organize in collaboration with British officials the Ionian state, often innovating in these aspects. Such capacity was based not only on personal experience but also on key texts. The two works that bridged Venetian governing practices of data collection and British Ionian colonial statistics were the historical statistical account of the city and island of Zante by Paolo Mercati, and the statistical historical account of Corfu by Stylianos Vlasopoulos, the work that was commissioned by the Academy in 1808 under French rule but published in 1822. These statistical accounts were inspired by the first scientific report during the French Republican rule by Carlo Botta, the Italian who joined the Napoleonic army in Italy and wrote the first so-called natural and medical history of Corfu, where he stayed for a year in 1798-99. Collection of information on the economy and the population of the islands systematized knowledge on the individual and the territory. The archaeology of this tradition, the origins of systematic information gathering, go back to medieval times. The first archive in Corfu dates from 1336, in Zante for 1485, while Kythera government documents were archived since 1530, and in Kefalonia since 1588. The dates represent the bureaucratic organization of local authorities to conform to the requirements of Venetian colonial administration, which happened elsewhere in the Venetian maritime state. Over time, these archives became depositories of historical knowledge, a quality that they maintain to this day. Travelers, foreign officials, and historians used these record offices to write histories of the islands, while the tradition of the Ionian archivist, librarian, historian, intellectual continues to the present. The collection of statistical information was part of this production of knowledge that besides ensuring future historical research, was part of its production of knowledge that aimed at efficient colonial governance. The Ionian state could claim a well-organized, even if not always functional, civil service already in the 1830s and the 1840s, when you had already people who were trained in this tradition. The governing principle introduced a new set of rules on how to administer natural resources and classified population as a resource for the first time. The transition from earlier pre-modern forms of rule was a smooth one because several Ionian politicians in the early years of the Protectorate and the fundamental institutions of land ownership remained intact until at least 1825 and the abolition of feudalism. New forms of knowledge and power introduced and were central for the Ionian colonial state to achieve its legitimacy over the ruled. When forms of achieving legitimacy and discipline became oppressive to a level that was not acceptable by the most advanced and radical Ionians, the colonial state's contradictions and its relation with the colonized reached breaking point. For several decades, however, producing colonial knowledge on the economy and the measurement of numbers and classifications developed independently from the politics of union of the Protectorate. My last example concerns something that is perhaps less well known, is the administration of the prison system and the reorganization of the prison system. I referred earlier to the development of the history of the police, let's say in the Ionian Islands. The building of new prisons and especially the management of the incarcerated became another field. It was, and according to Foucault and others after him, of course, one of the most fertile, so to speak, fields for governmentality and the rule of the state. The reorganization of the prison system was directed, and the person who oversaw it was Giovanni Kotsiris, or Ioannis Kotsiris, from Corfu, and it forms one of the finest examples of Ionian governmentality. Published in 1861, the report, if I can call it that, is an impressive as well as long, about 500 pages, and detailed, of course, account of the state of prisons in all islands, with a focus of the Corfu prison, the seat of Kotsiris. His book, Statistics of the Penitentiary of Corfu for the years 1857-59, is the first work of penology in Greece, published, however, in the Ionian Islands under British rule and in Italian. The work of Kotsiris exemplifies all the characteristics of the Ionian liberal bourgeoisie, their education, professional culture and practice, and the outcome of almost 5 decades of colonial governmentality. The book complemented an earlier treatise by Spiridione Androni, a liberal politician, lawyer, and reformer. Such examples show that by the end of the period of British rule, Ionian civil servants developed their own version of governmentality and state rule, and were operating independently of the issue of union, and were doing their job for the function of the Ionian state as best as they could. Such examples also reveal the expertise that went into the process of state building in the Ionian Islands, make the case for taking seriously into account the Ionian state in any debates on Greek state formation in the 19th century, and hopefully bring us closer to understanding what being properly governed meant for British, but especially for Ionians. Thank you very much.